Hello. In this episode of the A is for Architecture podcast, Professor of Urban Studies at the University of Basel and urban theorist Kenny Coopers discusses his new book, The Earth That Modernism Built, Empire and the Rise of Planetary Design, published by the University of Texas Press in 2024. We talk about the imperial legacies of modern architecture and infrastructure, and how colonial and post-colonial systems of planning, construction and environmental control shaped a global vision of design in the 20th century, one grounded in power and including the reciprocal relationship between empire and modernist design, the circulation of architectural knowledge between colony and colonizer, and the entangled histories of development, technology, and spatial control.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture, and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of A is for Architecture. I'm talking today to Kenny Coopers. Kenny, thank you so much for joining me.
It's great to be here.
Oh, it's fantastic, my privilege indeed. We're going to be talking about your remarkable, and wonderful book, The Earth That Modernism Built, Empire and the Rise of Planetary Design, which you published with the University of Texas Press in 2024, I think it was. Before we get on to discussing that book, and as per usual, would you be able and willing to introduce yourself?
Surely, yeah. So I'm a professor of architectural history and urban studies at the University of Basel. In Switzerland, and I was originally trained as an architect, and then got derailed, I guess, into a PhD in history of architecture and cities, and now I'm a head of urban studies in a social science department. So I've been kind of exposed to different kinds of disciplines and traditions, but my original training was in architecture.
Where did you train? Before we started recording, you said you're Belgian?
Yeah, so in Leuven, which was, the nearest university from my hometown.
You're from Leuven.
Yeah.
Beautiful. But you're not in Basel at the moment, you're in upstate New York.
Yes, just on a kind of a nostalgia tour, I guess, through the United States, because I gave a lecture at Illinois, the School of Architecture there, that I also taught at for a couple of years, and then I'll spend some time in New York as well.
Is that the Institute of Technology up there?
No, it's actually the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. The architecture school is the Illinois School of Architecture.
But you previously did your postdoc in Buffalo?
Yes. So I right after grad school, my first job was as a Rayner Banham Fellow at SUNY Buffalo, the university at Buffalo. And that was a wonderful time and an amazing city, very interesting place to be and experiment and think with, and wonderful colleagues at that school also.
I'm trying to make a link back into how you come to this book. You've approached this kind of thing that we kind of hero worship in architecture school, which is modernism, and you've taken a kind of very critical approach to it. And I'm wondering whether those experiences in those kind of places like Buffalo, those post-industrial, post-capitalistic in a way, environments, were formative on someone from the Western European context who perhaps we remain a little bit, in a way, protected from what actual modernity looks like.
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't thought about that link so much because I always bring back my, let's say, ambivalence. You can call it very critical, but ambivalent approach to modernism, I would perhaps say, to French housing and to seeing the kind of disastrous consequences of modernist beliefs, belief, that we can reshape society by changing the environment, by designing the environment. And I guess in Buffalo, you can see that too, but it's quite outside of, modernist discourse. And so I guess both places then provide a kind of vantage point to understand the limits and the failures and maybe also impotence or even irrelevance of modernism. So on the one hand, I would say, my approach to modernism is to take it seriously, which, but not too seriously. So to see it in context, right, in which it might play an important role or it might play a lesser role.
That's a very fascinating idea. That modernism, it seems to me to be kind of, certainly in architecture schools, this all-encompassing. It's the only true God. You know,
Yeah.
it's and everything is measured in relation to it, either historically or in the future. It's related back to these kind of heroic characters and these totemic figures and their works. But I like this idea that it might also just be a fractional thing or a fragmentary thing, which has a very distinct moment, which
Hmm.
shouldn't be now, if you know what I mean, without
Yeah.
wishing to jump to the end of your book, but like sort of it's had its day, it wasn't good, we need to move on.
Yeah, certainly I believe we're living with a kind of zombie of modernism still today, in the sense that it's still very much around, but in not a very productive way, and
Mhm.
in a kind of unreflected way, I would say.
How are you defining modernism here?
Yeah, so as a religion, as you just did. So I think most architecture historians would look at modernism, as a set of institutions, a set of discourses, and also a particular, approach to architectural language or to aesthetics. But I took up quite a different approach because I was interested in the kind of social consequences and social origins, perhaps, of modernism. So, and from that perspective, I think it's useful to define modernism as a belief, as a conviction that, a kind of optimistic but also scary conviction that we can, reshape a society and social relations and sometimes even human behavior by modifying and designing the environment in a certain way. And I think that's maybe the zombie that we live with if we look at, research and design studios and kind of projects that architects tend to come up with that address social issues, that address political issues, but that do so with design, sometimes just also on paper. Um, and I think there is that kind of belief that simmers there still.
That the world is somehow correctable.
Yeah. And you could say that's really not just a kind of 20th century architectural modernist problem. It's part of the modernity that we live in also. And perhaps that relationship is what I'm interested in.
Perhaps we can come back to the kind of origin story of that way of thinking. But I want to understand better the origin stories of this book. I mean, how did you come to the point of writing this book? Where does it stem from in your own research background? You've mentioned the catastrophe of peripheral French mass housing, which is
Yeah,
a controversial point in its own right. But we'll leave that. Well, we can't deal with all the controversies today, but
but that was the starting point in a way. So in that book, The Social Project, I was interested in the kind of modernist hubris, if you want, and the failures of modernism. And in doing that research, I was just interested in where that idea came from that I thought was still so strong, particularly in the French case, which in the post-war period, you could say architects had an unparalleled importance. At the time, they were given, through state institutions, etc., and planning bodies, Britain and other places as well. But very starkly in the French case, a kind of important role in shaping, housing, the outcomes of housing and new cities, new towns in ways that was both very hopeful and then that also led to these retracted and kind of problems, social problems that France still lives with today and that are kind of attached to these environments in an odd way. And so from that, I was interested in that kind of belief, let's say, modernism as a belief, as a conviction and relationship to humans as organisms, as biological creatures, and their environment. So it took a kind of environmental turn, and also very quickly a turn towards the 19th century and towards imperialist discourses about humans and the geographical environment.
Hannah Arendt talks about modernity's origins in the Reformation, of the Protestant Reformation, and in Galileo's telescope, but particularly in the discovery of the new worlds by Western European sailors, I suppose, adventurers, explorers, and their exploitation of that. Is this what we're talking about when we're talking about modernism? Or is modernism in architecture a sort of something that comes along much later through industrialization and those technologies that came along with it? And I guess from I don't know, the 1800s onwards.
I would say that's a question similar to asking about the origins of globalization or the origins of the Anthropocene.
Mm.
And the answer to those is that there are many different origin points, and
Hmm.
it depends what exactly one is interested in clarifying or trying to understand. So some people might or have looked at the origins of modern architecture in the 18th century and in the Enlightenment, right? And then some see it in the 19th century and in industrialization and new technology. And I was interested in that kind of environmental, human environment thinking relationship. So it's one of many different interpretations of
Mm.
modern.
But you see, as I read the book, The Earth That Modernism Built, and correct me if I'm wrong, but your thesis seems to be that under this regime of modernity, this paradigm of modernity, design becomes a tool of imperialism. It's a kind of deployed technique to enact the imperial or the colonialist agenda. So it's not just about aesthetics, not, but we teach it when we teach it. We say it's about this series of technologies and this kind of series of machine aesthetics, and doesn't it look cool? And it does look cool, unfortunately. But rather, it's kind of about a controlling of populations. And I suppose that's why I'm interested, because obviously Arendt's point about the discovery of the new worlds is this discussion around, and also in Galileo's telescope, and also in the Protestant Reformation, is this idea of this new encounter with the material world, with the cosmic world, arguably with the spiritual world, where it's red lined, as we would say in architecture. A red line is put around it. It's objectified, and thereby through that objectification, it can be exploited.
Yeah, that is a very, very good point. I think this notion of objectification is really a key step in this gradual process. I think Georges Canguilhem, the historian of science, who wrote about the living and its relationship to a milieu or an environment, also traces this idea back to early modern astronomy. And then goes on to see how this kind of evolves through different disciplines, how this is developed in different disciplines. And what stuck with me was 19th century geography, where you see these early explorations being interpreted in new ways, and that's how I stumbled across Friedrich Ratzel and his anthropo geography, as he called it, which was trying to understand the distribution of humans on the planet of the Earth through a series of laws, universal laws, kind of scientific or nomothetic laws that would apply universally. And so I guess this idea of an objectified landscape, but also an objectified population that has developed in tandem through modernity and through science as well as kind of experiments in rule.
No, I'm just trying to track this sort of as a chronologically. So there's this through the Enlightenment, through the 16th and 17th centuries, Enlightenment, 18th century Enlightenment. There's this encounter with the hitherto for largely unencountered new worlds, old worlds to the people that were living there, new worlds to Western Europeans. Just to be clear, and this kind of developed a kind of a positionality in relation to the Earth, which was new and unique, but then which came home, that was then brought home. Because I find that a fascinating dynamic, that actually, rather than something that was happening here that then got spread out, actually the experience of being in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, then influences and inflects the way that the world is produced here. Is that right?
Yeah, now I have a better sense of where you're going with this. I think in the we're talking multiple centuries,
Mm.
and I would maybe focus on the 19th century to see a moment in which a kind of, technologically boosted imperialism, which was really around the conquest and control of territories and resources,
Hmm.
or capitalist expansion. So for,
Hmm.
kind of global market, which had emerged already at that time, right? So that's, very different than what you were talking about in the early modern period. I think it's in that period that because this is such a powerful way of engaging with the world, problematically, of course, that also then at the same time reshaped how domestic territories are looked at. And so the German Empire is I think, a great example of that because
Hmm.
um, there was such a kind of an obsession, I guess, with land and with a kind of terra-centric way of empire building, based on the conquest of and control and cultivation of land. Um, so in the grand scheme of things, you could say this kind of, expansionist, colonial expansion from that emerges at an in the early modern period, does find, is folded back inwards. But at the same time, I think you could say in the 19th century, it's very much a kind of process of dialogue, of exchange between, experiments in overseas colonialism and then the kind of modernization or colonization of domestic territories. So I don't see it as a kind of, unidirectional development, but rather as a process of exchange between, experiments that take place at the kind of very borderlands of empire in Central Europe, in overseas colonial Africa, and even, very early on, then also at the outskirts of metropolitan areas, which, for some city dwellers was seen as a kind of outpost, similar to the colonial outback, if you will.
Mm. You use this idea of planetary design. Could you talk a little bit about that? I think it's kind of clear how that dynamic works in relation to, say, social policy, populations, putting people to work, stuffing children up chimneys and down coal mines and workhouses. I can understand that. That's kind of very clear to us. There was a deeply peculiar attitude towards what we would now call marginalized people. But I don't know if that's an appropriate term here, but this idea of people with less access to agency and power within a system. But how does this manifest in design? What is this concept of planetary design that you're proposing?
Yeah, with this notion of planetary design, I'm interested in the ways in which, the design and control of earthly environments across different scales, from very intimate to, very large scales, came to intersect with the management of people as kind of, populations, biological bodies, that were knowable in that particular way. And so I think about the planetary not so much as the planetary of, say, Christian Schmidt and Neil Brenner's planetary urbanization, which always has an idea of, the planet as a whole. And for me comes closer to, the global, perhaps, but more thinking about the planetary as, Gayatri Spivak defined it, planetarity as a kind of like earthly relationship and earthliness. And so to think about it across scales. And so in my book, I talk about planetary politics or planetary design, not necessarily as, designing continents, putting, redesigning entire continents, as was also, an element of my book, but also, for instance, thinking about farmhouses, and how they set up a particular relationship between their, intended inhabitants at times and the place that they were in, so that farmhouses could be used as a tool to strengthen imperial control and therefore also, kind of form of planetary design. So planetary design doesn't have to be about, transcontinental highways. It can also be about floor plans. And I think that's a useful way to think about the planetary, because, of course, today, when we think about anthropogenic implications of human behavior, sometimes at very minor scales, like throwing away plastic, they do have, planetary implications. So I think thinking across these scales about the planetary is useful. And so that is for me a way to relate the history of modernism to where we are today.
Mm.
And so I think that's a part of the cover of the book. Of course, it's to be seen whether the book fulfills that ambition, but it's to rewrite modernism for an era of ecological crisis, and so really and to think about that from the start. So not to take as I was saying in the beginning, to take modernism seriously and modernist discourse seriously, but not too seriously, or to put it in a kind of, jarring context. And the jarring context is empire.
I think that's really a fascinating idea. And I I was talking to my wife about this morning. I described it as best as I could over tea this morning. She was like, "No, absolutely, that's it." Because I've been struggling away with this idea for quite a while. I had a student this year, Segi Apuyan, who wrote her master's dissertation in part was based around the nature of colonialism in West Africa and its distinct character, the Western European version of this colonialism, this enslavement, as distinct from what had historically occurred in places where warring parties would enslave each other and turn each other into, chattels of one description or another. And her argument and her discussion was around the very distinct character of what this Western European and I guess latterly, internally to America and Australasia and stuff like that, that this was something very specific. And through your book, I'm sort of getting my head around what this means again, which is this kind of idea of modernization or modernism as an absolute and totalizing philosophy, as you say, almost like a religious philosophy that covers all components of life and therefore can be observed, as you say, in the floor plan or I got a book sent to me yesterday in the furnishings of houses, in the way that interiors are positioned, in the relationship of a veranda to a garden, even in so much as the cloth that we wear on our bodies. Is this kind of the idea that there is a very distinct quality, this colonialist approach, which is articulated or enhanced or amplified by modernism itself?
Short answer, yes, absolutely. Longer answer, or a different way of looking at it that I think would kind of amplify your point in a way, is to say how could modernism not be influenced by colonialism at a time in which that was so pervasive. So that's a more implicit, right? I think you're proposing a very active understanding of how a colonial mindset would, kind of, have direct parallels to kind of, modernist design. Another way, to zoom out from this is to say, we think of modernism as something that was developed, I don't know, in places like the Bauhaus, within a kind of model, within countries as kind of, territorial containers that sit one next to the other. But in fact, if, we think about the development of modernism from the late 19th century till, I don't know, mid 20th century, this was a world of empires. In fact, Germany was the one of the few places in the 1920s that saw itself as a few places, in Europe, of course, in the United States, that saw itself as not imperial, as post-imperial in a way. And because of that uniqueness, some argued, that was due to, of course, the outcomes of the First World War and the fact that, Germany's colonies and some of its territorial, some of its domestic territories had been reduced, wasn't the perfect place to lead us to a new world, as some German modernists called it. But this was in the, in a context of, that was a kind of German exceptionalism, right? After the Weimar exceptionalism. But in an otherwise thoroughly colonial world, right? If you think about the British Empire, the French Empire, and also the endurance of those empires after formal independence across, the global South and specifically the African continent, where neo-colonialism and this kind of other forms of empire, let's say, remained and became strong. So in that context, how could modernism be even conceived of as relating to, I don't know, something like the, set of nation states? And yet that is very much how the history of modernism has been written. If you look at, surveys of modern architecture, it's often, talked about as if, you know, Germany, Belgium, France, etc., were countries, were nation states, and not empires. So I think that's another way of thinking about the relationship, the historical context of modernism. And in a way, we're still living, through this historiography of modernism that has skewed it to such an extent that has made remained invisible. Although, of course, I think many scholars, I'm not the only one here, have been trying to correct this skewed way of looking at the world.
Very difficult to escape, though, isn't it? It is so, yeah, it's a very difficult animal to escape. And I'm fascinated by its stickiness as a concept because, as you say, you are not alone as a scholar of this period. And I guess one of the things that strikes me is that, like anything else, things can be two things. It can be both fundamentally a totalitarian instrument, but at the same time, in some mysterious way, quite egalitarian at the same time. That modernism, in a peculiar kind of way, and modernist design, there's a very good book by Jennifer Robinson called Ordinary Modernism, Ordinary
Ordinary cities.
Modernity, Ordinary Cities, that's it. The first book I read when I first started my PhD. And there's this idea that modernity isn't actually an exclusively Western European thing. This is, in a way, a problematic idea in its own right, that Western Europe births this thing and then deploys this thing across the world and sees it in its non-Western European context as sort of kind of like a dirty version of its true self, its Platonic form. I mean, how does that work? How does that dynamic work? How do you address that possibility that modernity is a kind of universal?
Yeah, it's important to distinguish modernity from modernism, and then also, my particular, let's say, interpretation of, or definition
Mm,
of modernism as this belief, right? Because if you think about modernism as kind of, you know, techno aesthetic experimentation, for instance, or a particular type of aesthetic movement
mhm.
or set of institutions, and clearly modernism is global. That doesn't mean, of course, that it is owned by everyone to the same degree, or that it is, egalitarian or producing egalitarian outcomes. And in my book, I try to um, approach modernism, even though, I paint a, quite a critical picture of one particular strand of modernism, as a, part of a German imperial project. I I see this very much as a, there are many different actors, there are many different agents of modernism, from, some of these German colonists in Namibia. Also, you could say anti-colonial resistance fighters, in a way, played an indirect role in spurring modernist experimentation, even though, as a form of, anti-colonial. And so I think that makes modernism as a historical process something that many people have agency in.
Mhm.
Um, but that doesn't mean it, serves everybody in some way, or that, and I'm quite critical of or see some limitations in this idea of global modernisms, and every trying to understand, for instance, some scholars have done Nigerian aesthetic experiments of the late 19th century, the early 20th century within within the world of global modernism, because in a way that can also entrench then kind of imperial view that you have modernism at the top, and then everybody else can also be modernist to some extent, right? But
Hmm.
then whose modernism is this, or what kind of
Mm.
modernism? For me, I found it more useful to think about the particular politics of land and life, let's say, of right, this kind of control of population and environment in a particular context of the German Empire, rather than understanding, how this all travels across.
Mhm.
That doesn't mean that's not interesting. I think there's wonderful and really important work on kind of trans-imperial exchanges, southern exchanges, south-south, as in the post-war period. They're often described. Um, but for me, as I was interested in modernism as this problematic belief, I thought this restriction to a particular imperial setup was most productive.
You talk in, I think it's chapter three, isn't it, about this idea. Well, you talk about it generally, but this idea of this biological functionalism, that some of these, what I called in my notes to you, back to the land movements, these ruralization programs and greening cities programs. I guess we might even see it now, which reminds me of the Des Fitzgerald book, The City of Today is a Dying Thing. There's this idea that there's a relationship, an inherent relationship between peoples and land. And this is used to create the idea of race, which is then obviously revealed most explicitly in, firstly, the colonies, and then in Germany's own self-immolation during the Third Reich. And I think this is a terrifically challenging idea, not controversial, but it's a challenging idea. Could you talk a little bit about like this idea? Who came up with this idea around this association between people and land? What forms it? And you mentioned science earlier on. And where is it perhaps most clearly and explicitly visible? What projects? Whose architecture?
Yeah, so I would say to understand where it comes from, it's useful to look at 19th century geographic or 19th century geography, where people like Karl Ritter and then Friedrich Ratzel, came up with this idea that people were shaped by their environment as much as they then subsequently shaped them.
Hmm.
So for a long time, this has been understood as an environmental determinism. And environmental determinism would then be used, kind of in vernacular ways, you could say, to argue why, African peoples are less productive, right? This kind of climatological determinism. So that's already, of course, very much about enforcing racial distinction
Mm.
through, scientific kind of scientific assumptions, and that I was interested in how that kind of, came to shape architecture. So first is I think that this environmental determinism is often actually not deterministic so much as possibilistic. Even Ratzel himself, who was accused of this, would say people are shaped by their environment, and then they reshape it, they cultivate it, they improve it. And thereby, by looking at the landscape and the ways that people have improved them, you can, see how much they are racially superior. And of course, this was a kind of, universalizing idea. You could, analyze the various types of people and societies, but Germany always ended up on top. Right. And this is very similar to Schulze Naumburg and other reformers and architects who would say, design is about change the surface of the earth and the way it looks, right? So design is about how I don't know, till the land as much as the kind of houses that I build and the infrastructure. But at the same time, design is also about kind of German supremacy, German superiority through design. So I think it's a similar kind of universalizing imperialist thinking. And so that percolates in architecture, particularly through anti-urban ideologies, this back to the land movement, as you say, and through an interest in farmhouses. Farmhouses that were, often disappearing in a context of rapid industrialization and rural flight, but that for some researchers became a kind of index of identity, racial identity, and also held a kind of promise to build a future society. This was a kind of reactionary modernism, or became a kind of reactionary modernism, right? That you could, change society, but kind of bring it back to where it was. And it was quite jarring because reformers would then come up with solutions that looked very conservative, but that were in fact quite revolutionary in social terms because they enforced, for instance, racial distinctions onto the land. So I look in the book at how farmhouse researchers, it was really a kind of obsession, not just in Germany but also in other countries, with farmhouses. Looking at how they were spread in different regions, what that meant. Looking at the form of the house, but also the floor plan was really important to try and understand the kind of racial essence of the people that built it. But of course, no distinction was made between that who built it, who inhabited it, how it changed over time. It was all very much kind of essentialized and abstracted into a type. And I think that's also then how modern architects throughout the 20th century used type designs, floor plans to try and, kind of imagine who would live in those places and then also what kind of social outcomes you would get through that.
Mm.
So what is usually seen as, kind of very conservative interests were actually, you could say, futuristic, but in this reactionary sense, of course.
And in the end, in a deeply traumatic sense.
Yeah, of course. An example that I look at is Prussian colonialism. So the Prussian Empire, in the late 19th century, reached in large parts of what is now Poland, and at the time had a Polish majority in some regions. And that was a problem for some of the German imperialists at the time who wanted to kind of Germanize these environments, these entire regions. And they wanted to do that by resettling farmers, not by creating cities. Cities were considered to be, potentially dangerous. You could get, right, democracy and socialism
Hmm.
in those places, right? So these were considered not desirable types of environments, but rather the idea was that to bind Germans to the land would create a kind of more solid nation. It was also a way to deal with the kind of contradictions of industrial capitalism, right? The creation of a vast proletariat.
Mm.
And so it was a kind of way to avoid proletarianization and enforcing empire and nationhood.
I mean, a lot of what you're saying, there seems to be, it's almost like the modernist project operates like Bentham's panopticon as described by Foucault, which I think is fascinating, that it's not just in the cities or in the building itself, but actually in this interpretation of the world as a whole. That is something that needs curation by a wise elite who are capable of managing that. And architects gain this position in this period to be that person.
Yes, so the one of the ideas that modernism has brought is that the architect could be some kind of enlightened social engineer.
Hmm.
If you see that throughout the 20th century, and I you know in this project that you can see it already in this Prussian colonialism, in the Prussian colonization. It's important also to emphasize that this failed by all measure. Polish nationalism was a direct response to this kind of colonial intervention. As land prices skyrocketed, the Prussian Settlement Commission, which was the main, kind of institution that was meant to settle all these German farmers. I had a lot of trouble making this all work. It came up with, specific housing types to enforce segregation between German farmers, often the ones who then own the land, and Polish seasonal farmers, guest workers, you would call them later, I guess, which also failed because this didn't correspond to the realities of how agricultural labor worked at the time. So it's really important, I think, to mention that this kind of social engineering was fueled by anti-colonial nationalism by Polish communities at the time. And so, yeah, that's, I think, one way in which, you could say this was not only about the colonizer's agency.
I mean, there's a lot here that I think it's extremely rich and, as I say, a challenging thesis, and one that I'm minded to agree with. It reminds me of a paper written in 1979 by a man called Thomas Hubka called Just Folks Designing. It's in the JE, I think, or something like that. Just Folks Designing, and he talks about this idea of the vernacular in popular discourse or in academic discourse, particularly architecture, as this kind of environmental determinism, as equating human beings to birds, the way that birds make nests, humans make housing, which is a fascinatingly problematic idea, and one that's, again, incredibly sticky when we think about indigenous architecture and vernacular and traditional environment. I want to come to this final issue, though, which is this continuation or the legacy or the shadow of this idea. This idea that we still have, which is that nature is a cleanser, is a social cleanser, and that ultimately the objective or the goal of our species is to be at one with nature, and that will make us better. And I'm kind of interested in whether this is something that is indicated in your book, in your research.
Yeah, so I think where what we started with in the beginning, this kind of idea of modernism as a kind of zombie that is still around us, you see in so many different ways. Just echoing what you were saying before about kind of climate determinism. I just finishing another paper with a colleague in Nairobi about the architecture school there, which after independence, continued for a very long time with this idea that, design was just about kind of climate, adapted building types. And that very much, dovetailed with a kind of neo-colonial regime of Kenya at the time. And so I think you see the stickiness of that in post-war modernism, in developmentalism, um, but also in very large scale, let's say, eco-modernist projects. Egypt is undertaking a large-scale desert reclamation project. Many different, countries are currently doing such projects that are about transforming vast ecosystems in ways that are, of course, often enormously destructive of those ecosystems. And this then goes under sometimes, not always, but under the idea, of kind of nature-based design, or as you called it before. So there's a kind of implicit determinism and an idea that these, ecological outcomes are somewhat, controllable, and perhaps that optimism is inevitable. Um, Maybe it's very difficult to give up that kind of determination, but I would also see it as, and maybe that's from the, luxurious position of being a historian and not having to, propose design solutions today, is that it could also be a kind of symptom that of a condition in which transforming the world as a political project, of collective organizing, of institution building, of governance, seems so nearly impossible today that design has come as seems to be a kind of rescue, or um, um, and so I would say that that is the kind of uh, you know, conundrum that we're living with today. Is that on the one hand, it's very difficult to give up that design optimism. On the other hand, yeah, it's kind of symptom of a political impasse.
What does it look like, this possible other future that doesn't kind of depend on this totalizing, controlling planetary design? Because I suppose what I wonder about, you use this word optimism, and I think that's a lovely word to use in relation to design, which is always projective. It's always into the future. We design for the future because things take time to make, architecture particularly, cities particularly. So the modernist kind of optimism is also part of it. It's like we can improve everybody. We can make everybody as good as us, which translates into a kind of fundamental racism, which is obviously disastrous. But the optimism isn't to be rejected. So how do we design?
I would have said that's the million-dollar question, but that is of course I think the challenge that so many architecture students are facing in their design studios, right? In the last 10 years, but even yeah, the last ten years particularly, I've also been engaged, with colleagues and collaboration with institutions and scholars and activists across the global south, particularly in Cape Town, institutionally. But one project that came out of this collaboration was called South Designs, Planetary Futures, where we wanted to understand what design means in conditions in the global south, conditions, often scarcity and marginalization. And here we focused really on social processes of collaboration and organizing as a starting point for rethinking what design might mean in social terms. And so I think that's maybe one solution is to start with the social practices that constitute design. So rather than projecting, design first and then kind of seeing what social arrangements might emerge from that, starting with the social processes and then seeing where the agency of design lies. I think that's something that, we see also many architects and designers engaging with today. Um, Often, of course, the problem there is scale and the fact that these are difficult and extremely labor intensive ways to think about design that do not correspond to the structures of merit and the profession of architecture today. But we see them at least as experiments in pedagogical experiments that might offer some kind of solution.
It's an interesting one. I think of that famous, I think it was Karl Rove, George W. Bush's psychopath in chief, who talked at some press conference to the press, and he was saying, you will have your ideas and you will have your critical practices and you will have and in the meantime, we will carry on making the world. And I feel a little bit like perhaps this is the negative person, I cultivate one, a little bit like some of these kind of marginal reapproaches to design thinking are very interesting. In the meantime, neoliberalism carries on replicating this planetary design, and it's filling up all our cities and it's building everywhere. And we kind of squeak at the edges.
Yeah, and you could even go further and say the squeaking at the edges actually reinforces dominant structures, right? It's by letting those experiments kind of happen at the side that more sustained, um, transformation would be made possible. So I think that's the big question, right? How can we, sustain initiatives and use them to remake the institutions that govern us
Mm,
rather than keeping them at the margin? But that's easier said than done, of course.
it is. It's a good point to finish on. Thank you very, very much, Kenny, for speaking with me. It was a great joy.
It was great to be in conversation. Thanks so much.
And now over to Mr. Sam Fender. I'm not preaching, I'm just talking. I don't wear the shoes I used to walk in, but I can't help thinking where they'd take me in this crumbling empire. No idea what that's about, but it mentions empire, and I heart the feels. Thanks to Kenny for taking the time to speak with me, and to the University of Texas Press for the PDF of the book. It's fascinating and very worth reading. Please see the podcast description for links to the book and to Kenny. And thanks for listening.